It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Well, it's the first week of Pride Month 2026. Happy Pride. And we will turn now to Pride Month sponsorships heading into this year. You know, the Wall Street Journal reported the other day a new trend. For the second consecutive year, Pride organizations nationwide are facing budget shortfalls as companies including PepsiCo, Nissan, MasterCard, Citibank, and others have pulled back or withdrawn entirely. The recent piece, written by reporter Patrick Coffey, cites economic pressures and fear of political backlash from the Trump administration's anti-DEI stance. So what does this all say about corporate allyship? And what does it reveal about how businesses navigate political risk, or maybe what's going on in the broader political moment? And why does what corporations do or don't even matter to human rights? Joining us now is Reilly Steel, Associate Professor of Law at the Columbia University Law School. Reilly's research focuses on the intersection of business and law and politics. He published a major peer-reviewed 2025-2026 study in the American Political Science Review that used empirical data on nearly 100,000 corporate directors and executives to track how corporate America's political orientation has shifted over 2 decades, with a specific focus on how individual ideology drives firms' public stances on LGBTQ related legislation. I know that it's a lot, but it really, really spotlights the current moment. Hey, Reilly, thanks for coming on. Welcome to WNYC.
Hey, Brian, thanks so much for having me. Delighted to be here.
So your research tracks the political preferences of tens of thousands of corporate directors and other executives. How much are you seeing companies pulling back from Pride sponsorships that their companies used to fund since President Trump got reelected?
So anecdotally, we're definitely seeing a lot of that. There were some examples you cited up top, MasterCard, Nissan, for example, also some federal defense contractors, Booz Allen Hamilton. So we're seeing a broad but not complete retrenchment because many firms have continued to maintain their sponsorship levels. So I think we're seeing a pretty varied corporate landscape here.
And what does that tell you about how corporate political behavior or even business decisions actually work depending on who's in power?
Yeah, I think it tells us something that might seem obvious, which is that corporations are not human beings. They do not have principles that they're going to stick to no matter what. Instead, they're artificial legal persons that are subject to all sorts of pressures from all sorts of different stakeholders. That includes employees, managers, shareholders, customers, and which is especially visible right now, the government, including the federal government. So corporate leaders are going to have to balance all these different pressures. And when the balance of power shifts among the stakeholders, or the preferences of the stakeholders change, we should expect the company's behavior to also change. I think we're seeing exactly that right now.
Yeah, I guess another way to put it might be that companies in general, not every company, but companies in general, do have a set of principles or a guiding North Star principle that they stick to, and that is that they have a fiduciary responsibility to make as much money as they can for their shareholders. And if that means changing behavior to some degree based on who's in power in Washington, then so be it.
Yeah, the shareholder primacy norm is very strong. It's basically indoctrinated into MBA students in business schools. And I think that corporate leaders take that pretty seriously. So if that means what you need to do to make money is to abandon your prior commitments to, let's say, Pride sponsorship, then that's what a lot of companies are going to do.
The NBA is unifying in New York City right now. MBA is not so much. Is there a way to quantify these impacts from the last 2 years? Do we know how much money is lost for New York Pride events this year, or if the scope of celebrations has actually become smaller because the money isn't there to do what they were doing?
I'm not sure. I'm not aware of anyone who's tried to systematically quantify the impacts. I know that some city pride organizations have been in the red because of the lost sponsorship money, but others have founded sort of found alternative sources of funding. But I'm not sure exactly on how the counting breaks down.
Should we,
But anecdotally, it seems like it's having an effect.
listeners, we can take calls on two tracks here. First, for those of you helping to organize Pride Month events, have you seen corporate sponsorship drop since the second Trump administration began? 212-433 WNYC, help us report this story. Where are you taking financial hits and how are you mitigating them or trying to? Call or text 212-433 WNYC 433-9692. And for those of you who participate in Pride Month, how do you see corporate sponsorship overall? We're going to get into how not everybody who, is fiercely interested in Pride has always been so happy about corporate sponsorship. On the one hand, it's advertisement to the LGBTQ community, whether it's a product or the company is signaling it's a pro-LGBTQ workplace. On the other hand, if you've been going to Pride for years or decades, sponsorship has increased the scale of the events, while at the same time making them, to some people's eyes, more icky because they're so corporate. 212-433 WNYC 433-9692. And even beyond those two things, acknowledging and celebrating the LGBTQ community is just one of the many aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, right, that are being targeted by the Trump administration. And our guest from the Columbia University Law School is an expert on all of this. So we can also take your calls if you work on some level with any DEI measures and what's changing at your company, because this is really about businesses changing with political winds. Help us report that part of the story. 212-433 WNYC 212-433-9692. Call or text. Professor, let's touch on that other way to look at corporate sponsorship of Pride events. On the one hand, oh my God, it's drying up because Trump is pressuring everybody. On the other hand, there are those within the LGBTQ community who have seen it for years as a shallow kind of rainbow capitalism, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I mean, I think in some sense, it has always been shallow, and that's because, like I sort of said up top, corporations are not human beings. So that's not really a surprise in some sense. They're going to engage in support for Pride or LGBTQ rights more generally, only to the extent that it's going to be good for the firm, or to the extent the managers, the people, the leaders who are actually making these decisions maybe care about it personally. That can also influence what they're doing. So, I mean, I think those critics are right. On the other hand, it's kind of a matter of perspective. So, is it what should we expect firms to do? If you think about sort of politicians, kind of representing the interests of their constituents. You can kind of draw an analogy there and think, well, okay, firms are also going to represent the interests of their constituents. Who are those people? Their stakeholders, including their employees. And what firms are going to be doing is going to be depending on sort of what their constituents are really pushing for.
Some companies that are still giving money to Pride events have asked to be silent partners, I see. That means they'll cut a check, but they don't want to be named publicly. In 2025, Target continued sponsoring New York City Pride at the same dollar level, but as a, quote, silent partner, requesting not to be listed as a platinum donor, from what I've read. What does it mean when a company wants to support something but doesn't want anybody to know about it?
Probably that they're worried about becoming the target of political pressure or legal pressure from the federal government. And they think if they can hide this, okay, I can avoid that sort of pressure, but maybe I can still tell my employees or others that we're trying to do the right thing in a more silent way. So kind of trying to have your cake and eat it too. That would be my interpretation anyways.
Now, some companies, and I referenced this in the intro, say this cutback on supporting Pride events is about tariff uncertainty and tightening budgets in this economy, not politics. So we have the group Heritage of Pride, their corporate partnerships director in New York, told Cranes that the economic explanation came up more than DEI in his conversations with sponsors. But is there a way to fact check? Do you believe that, or is there a way to disentangle the economic explanation from the political one?
I mean, I don't know that I really believe it. I think it's hard to fact check. Suppose if you wanted to sort of test that hypothesis, you could look at whether firms that are more sort of subject to financial constraints are especially likely to pull back. I haven't seen anyone try to do that with Pride displays specifically. I can tell you that I have an ongoing research project that looks at the rise and fall of DEI commitments by companies more broadly. So not just Pride, but basically how much do companies commit to DEI and their disclosures. And I find that when the interest rate environment tightened, and this is a co-authored study, we find that when the interest rate environment tightened, this was a couple of years ago, it was not the case that those companies that were most prone to interest rate exposure pulled back more. So that's kind of inconsistent with this economic explanation. Now that doesn't speak to the tariff situation, but it does speak more broadly to, are companies pulling back from DI because this was some sort of like luxury behavior that they could engage in because they had the money for it and now they don't. That doesn't seem to really be borne out in the data.
Aria in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Aria. Thanks for calling in.
Hi, Brian. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we hear just fine.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that as a member of several professional organizations, although like sort of the fight against DEI has been a thing and sort of present, a lot of it has just resulted in a rebrand. So I've seen things like supplier diversity nights reframed as supplier engagement nights, focusing more on the small business aspect, especially externally, but really still platforming like Black-owned and small-owned, like small businesses, for example, as well as queer-owned businesses. And so like what I've seen in the personal sector or the professional sector has just been a lot of that. Rebranding to focus on different aspects of the exact same portions of DEI, because for the most part, I mean, DEI initiatives are good for business, whether it's a branding perspective or just diverse thought. And most business leaders recognize this and don't want to lose that. That's just something I've seen. The very tag of queer-owned businesses, too, is just, I mean, in today's environment, it can be anything. Palantir and OpenAI are both queer-owned businesses. So, the definition can change, and, it doesn't exactly align with everybody's interests anymore. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Aria. Yeah, really interesting, complicating point there at the end. Some of those corporations that, of course, are so controversial for other reasons might have some LGBTQ leaders. But so you can react to that if you want, but also to Aria's initial point that DEI continues at a lot of places, businesses, but they just don't call it that right now.
Right. Yeah, the language around it has changed to some extent. So some scholars have called this diversity hushing. So people have talked about diversity washing in the past, where like, it's all talk, but you're not actually backing up that talk with real, genuine action. So this is kind of the flip side of that. We're like, you're continuing to do the same stuff underlying it, but you're just kind of changing the language around it. So I think that's part of what we're seeing. But to the extent that companies are, let's say, pulling sponsorship money out of Pride, that's a real action. That's not just talk. They're also, I think, changing the actions they're taking. So I think we're seeing a bit of both.
Let's take another call. Tim in Manhattan. You're on WNYC. Hi, Tim.
Hey there. I just wanted to mention that there are also international ramifications. This is from an article in the Irish Times from June 15th, 2025. 12 of 42 major American corporations pulled out of Pride last year in Ireland, in Dublin. So there are these international, I know things have happened in other countries too, but specifically Ireland, which has major, U.S. ties with corporations. But again, if anybody wants to reference that, it's the June 15th, 2025 Irish Times article about 1/4 of major U.S. firms pull out due to fears of Trump. That's the title of the article.
Tim, thank you for referencing that article. We'll check that out. But Professor Steel, interesting about the international implications, because he's not talking about Irish companies pulling out, right? At least that's not what the article that he's referencing was apparently about, but U.S. companies that help, I guess multinational companies that are based here that help fund Pride events in other countries, 12 out of 42 pulling out in Ireland as that example.
Yeah, I did not know about that, but I'm not surprised to hear it, given that multinational firms headquartered in the U.S. have these sorts of activities elsewhere. I mean, it's a reflection of the sort of huge magnitude of U.S. geoeconomic political power that the actions here in the United States can have ripple effects across the world, and that's reflected in like pulling out of the Paris Agreement about climate, all sorts of things. Absolutely.
The Wall Street Journal article that we mentioned earlier by Patrick Coffey includes how corporate pride sponsorships are unlikely to actually violate anti-DEI policy, as the Trump administration defines it, because those policies are designed mostly to celebrate employees, and that doesn't fall outside of the guidelines as opposed to hiring and promotion preferences. Right. But he writes the companies with government contracts could still lose valuable business if the administration determines that they're out of step. So this goes beyond, if I'm reading that, that little section of that article correctly, it means this is not just about what's legal, because, of course, the Trump administration is suing businesses and universities and others for allegedly violating civil rights laws by having any DEI. But even this, which is just an internal way or a way of celebrating employees, not promoting or hiring different people, if that puts them out of step, they may lose contracts anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can distinguish between preferential hiring and promotion on the one hand, and the Trump administration has argued that violates the civil rights laws. But then there's this other side of DEI that is so much broader than that. It's about celebrating particular cultures, making sure everyone feels included, making sure that people from marginalized groups have an opportunity to participate. So, for example, at law firms, they often have these client events that give attorneys an opportunity to build relationships with clients. Some firms traditionally have structured those client events around things like golf outings, which you can imagine, okay, that's great for the attorneys who play golf, and the ones who've never stepped foot on a golf green in their life maybe don't feel so comfortable embarrassing themselves by joining this golf event. So under the rubric of diversity and inclusion, many firms have structured alternative sorts of events that are built around other sorts of activities, oftentimes through affinity groups. Those could be, affinity groups structured around race or gender or sexuality that have other sorts of activities. But the Trump administration seems to be going to even attacking those sorts of activities, which, look, I'm not an anti-discrimination law expert, but it seems to me there's no violation of anti-discrimination law there, even if preferential hiring and promotion would count. Yes, the administration is going much further, and they're using their kind of soft power over, let's say, allocating federal contracts to exert those sorts of levers. So even if they couldn't bring an anti-discrimination lawsuit, well, they have some discretion over whom to award federal contracts to, and that discretion, unchecked by any sort of legal oversight, is what's allowing them to do this. And I think we're seeing real effects here. In this research project I'm doing, we find that federal contractors disproportionately pulled back on DEI commitments in this administration. I mean, there's a broad pullback, but contractors pulled back especially, which I think is a reflection of this kind of soft power the administration has over them.
A couple of interesting texts that came in. One says, I joined the 1973 Pride March when there was no corporate sponsorship and you risked your job by being there. Marching was a political statement. Most people attending now are there for a party. Another one includes this question: who within the company is making the decisions about Pride funding? That is, at what level are such decisions made? Can you answer that?
Good question. I don't know for sure, and I think it varies by company. You could have this being made at the C-suite level, or you could have it being made at lower level in the company, and I'm sure it depends on the company where exactly those decisions are being made. So I don't have a clear, all-encompassing answer for that one.
Before you go, let me touch on this other story. We may have time for one or two more calls, but I want to make sure we get this in. There's news that the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, is changing some of its policies now under the Trump administration. This is new just in the last few days. As NPR reported it on Monday, the EEOC will stop collecting data on where people of color and women are not getting hired or promoted. Are you familiar with what that data does historically and the recent realignment?
I'm not super familiar on the EEOC's use of this particular data, but I do know that we're seeing in the Trump administration, including at the EEOC, a sort of realignment of civil rights enforcement to target so-called reverse discrimination, basically alleged discrimination against white men, and doing less to target the forms of the forms of discrimination the EEOC is traditionally targeted, namely against people of color and women. So this is, I think, what this action reflects is sort of another step in that realignment.
And this is not a new fight at the EEOC. I just saw that article this morning, but if I have my history right, and you study this, so maybe you know, wasn't it under President Ronald Reagan that Clarence Thomas was appointed to head the EEOC? Because even way back in the 1980s, in the Reagan era, that president wanted to undo some affirmative action policies that he saw as discriminating against whites. And we know what Clarence Thomas's attitudes are on these things. We certainly know from his Supreme Court decisions. And then from there, he was plucked by the following president, George H.W. Bush, to be put on the Supreme Court precisely for those reasons.
Yeah, you're right. Clarence Thomas was headed the EEOC back in the 80s, and he has had a long-standing sort of opposition to preferential hiring and promotion on the basis of race. And yeah, this is a much longer fight. This is not a new fight. This is a fight that's been going on for decades, and this is just kind of the latest chapter in it.
Let's see. Do we have one more call? Let me just see if this caller is there. Nope. I guess we're going to leave it there with Reilly Steel. Actually, can I go to line 2, Mary? Is that relevant here? All right, let's see about giving Margie in Pine Bush, New York, the last word. Margie, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, Brian. I just want to talk about the word pride and how it relates to those who are not in the LGBTQ community and how it's such an important term for a pluralistic society that we live in. I'm Jewish, I'm a Democrat. I live in a small conservative town where most people are, Republican and Christian. And there is a sense of not pride, of like keeping your head down, of not shame exactly, but like maybe if I was a more outspoken person, but like my neighbor who's Puerto Rican, like she keeps her lawn extra mode because she's afraid that people are going to think less of, Puerto Ricans if she has unmowed lawn. And it's just like this sense in so many small towns that, I don't know, that you don't fit in, that you're not part of, and that you should have pride in who you are if we're America and we are a pluralistic society. So I just wanted to relate to the term pride as a larger umbrella.
Thank you, Margie. It's a wonderful way to end this conversation, I think, Professor Steele, because, you're a professor at Columbia University in the middle of New York City. Most of our listeners are in the New York metro immediate area, where it may be one thing and it may be hard enough around there, and then you get into smaller towns like she lives in, and it's hard to pop your head up and be who you are in so many ways. And that's the whole point of Pride, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, I think about that even over time. I grew up in the Bay Area, which is sort of a mecca for inclusivity. At least most people think about it that way. But when I was growing up, it wasn't like what it was today. There was lots of bullying of gay kids, even in the liberal Bay Area back then. So I think that it's a good perspective to keep both across spaces and over time, that pride is not guaranteed.
Reilly Steel, Associate Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, who has studied, among other things, the impact of the political environment on business behavior. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me.